All right, team, welcome to our Level 4 Financial Statements of Limited Companies revision session. In today's session, we will be looking at task 3 of the mock that you all should have handy with you. If you don't have a copy of the questions, I'm going to put in the chat box a link, i.e. it's a link to where you registered for our sessions, our AAT revision sessions. There you will see that there is more information given on how you can access future recordings, and it also gives you information of how you can get the questions that are required to attempt for these revision sessions as well. So what are we looking at today? As mentioned on that slide, today's session is all about task 3. So if you've got the question in front of you, let's try and look into what is this task all about. So task 3 in your real exam is around 8 marks. And for an 8-mark question, I'm hoping that we could take around 8 minutes to do it. So in a task like this, what do you find most difficult? Please use the chat box to tell me, what do you find most difficult in a task like this? Okay, so we've got quite a few people saying that they find this task okay, it's not bad. Well, the good news is that's what the examiner thinks as well, i.e. the examiner has stated that in the past, in last year, the number of people that have passed this task on a percentage format is around 54% of students have performed well, have got good marks. This task is all about your Ias Conceptual Framework. Remember, a framework is not a standard. A framework is not a standard, i.e. it's not rules and regulations that you have to follow. In fact, they are principles. Principles, what do principles mean? Principle means that you have guidelines. This is what you need to follow. You need to be a good, honest citizen of this country. That's a principle. There are loads of things that can fall within the principle, and that's one of the benefits of having a principle rather than a rule. Because rules, people can find different ways of playing around with the rules, of bending the rules. However, with principles, a lot of different things are encapsulated within it. I like to think about principles like an umbrella that has everything else within it. Someone has nicely put in there that what I find I want to do in a task like this, I want to put too many information. Why? Because I want to show to the marker, look, I know my stuff. Look, I know my stuff. And just in case, if one of the points is wrong, you're going to give me marks for an extra point that I've written. And sadly, that's one of the weaknesses that the examiner has noticed in a task like this. So what are the weaknesses that the examiner has noticed, or what would be my suggestion for you to do in a task like this? First and foremost, make sure you relate the length of your answer to the marks, to the marking guide provided. So in this task, it's for 8 marks. So how many points do you think an 8-mark question would require? On average, a rough idea. How many points? Perfect. There, I should be aiming for at least 8 valid points. And that's all points that I need to write. Be careful, everyone. In this paper, people do struggle with time. People do struggle with time and don't finish the paper. If you're going to be really good in one question, let's say in this one, the maximum marks the examiner is going to give you is 8. If you've written 20 points, the maximum marks he or she is going to give you is 8 marks. So in the other tasks, you're not going to get enough marks because you did not have the time to do the other tasks. So my suggestion would be, please make sure you stick to the time. As soon as it's 8 minutes past, you need to move on to the next task. Give all the tasks the equal importance. Another thing that the examiner says that if he or she finds is difficult or that the students are not doing good enough is linking the answer to the scenario given. The examiner has noticed that students are not linking their answers to the scenario given. They are writing their answers in a very generic way. So I've learned several points about something. I'm just going to write the same several points in each and every answer. Any question, I'm going to write the same points. Sadly, that's not going to give you enough marks. You are now level 4 students. AAT is asking a lot more than you, more than that. So let's try, especially those of you who've got your exams coming quickly, in a couple of days or in next month, bear in mind, make a note somewhere, this is what I will be doing in this task. Because I'm sure most of us have the knowledge. However, the thing that most of us do struggle with when it comes to exams is the exam technique. So with that in mind, let's not waste any more time, but have a look at what we have to do in this task. So task 3, as I mentioned, is all about the conceptual framework. What are the different subtasks given to me? So as I can see in this question, there's A, there's B, there's C, there's D. And D has further subtasks of 1 and 2. So question 1, let's do A first. A says, identify the 5 elements in accordance with the IASP conceptual framework for financial reporting. The question is identify. What does identify mean? First and foremost, we need to try and understand what is the examiner asking of us. The examiner is only asking me to identify. The examiner is not asking me to explain. The examiner is not telling me to write massive paragraphs on them. The examiner is only asking me to identify, i.e. list the 5 elements. And the easy way to remember the 5 elements is to go back to level 2 when you were learning your foundation of accounting. If you remember, think about the word debt click. And I'm hoping we have seen or heard about this terminology before. Debt click. It says debit, expenses, assets, drawings, credit, liabilities, income, and capital. So with that, the elements become a lot easier because what are my elements? My elements that make up my accounts is, with the help of my debt click, it's going to be my expenses. It's going to be my assets. It's not going to be drawings though. So we'll leave that for now. Credit, liability, certainly I'll take that in. Income. And it's not going to be capital as well. The reason why it's not drawings nor capital, because when I learned that, or when you learned that in level 2 foundation, you were dealing with whom? You were dealing with sole traders. What's this unit called? Financial statements of limited companies. And in companies, they don't have drawings, nor do they have something called as capital. But instead, what do we call them in the land of company? Equity. But I'm hoping you can use this to remember your elements. So the 5 elements are expenses, assets, liabilities, income, and equity. So for a question like that, I would be thinking of just writing the 5 elements. That's all the question has asked me. I'm just going to write that. It would be around, let's say this would be around 1 mark. Okay. I'm just coming up with some marks here. Let's put it as 1 mark. In total, the whole task 3 is 8 marks. Now, part B of the question is define. Now is asking me to write more than what I've just stated. Not list, but define 3 of these elements. And as someone mentioned before, I want to write all 5 purely because I'm worried if one of them is wrong, at least I'll get some marks on the other. Fair point. I agree with you. That could happen. But do you have the time is the question I'm going to ask you. I.e., what I would do if I was you would just write 3 for now, move on, finish the entire exam, and then if I still have half an hour left, I'll go back to it. I'll go back to it and write another point. We need to make sure we give equal importance to each and every question. So when it comes to define the elements, we need to be very specific. You cannot write it in, assets is something that I own. Liabilities is something that I owe. What we learned in level 2 and level 3. No, that is not good enough here. This is all to do with your ISB, conceptual framework. So we need to write it in those principles, in those terminologies point of view. So when it's asking me define, it has to be specific. So when I'm talking about, for now, I'm defining all of them. But remember in the exam, I'm going to only stick to 3. So let's take assets first. So when I'm defining assets, the kind of words that I'm looking for, in fact, for part B, I'm going to do it on another piece of paper purely because otherwise it's just going to be everywhere. So let's call this guidance for task 3. Again, everyone, you don't need to write everything that I'm writing here unless you can't understand my handwriting. But I will be sending out my annotated notes to everyone who's registered for today's session. What I do want you is to gain the maximum out of the session by asking me questions, by participating, and by understanding what we are talking about. So guidance for task 3, so you know what I'm talking there. Then let's talk about task 3B. Assets. It's the first one we're looking at. Oops. So the key words that in your answer, in a sentence, the way you're defining it, basically, let's first talk about the definition. An asset is a present obligation. Sorry, present economic resource controlled by the entity. So entity is a company as a result of past event. And then I need to explain what an economic resource is. An economic resource is the right to produce future economic benefits. So your answer in the exam has to be as precise as this sentence or these couple of sentences are. But what are we looking at? The key words. Can anyone tell me what are the key words that your definition should include? So from this couple of sentences that I've just written in front of you, that you can see on the screen, what are the key words? I'll give you a guess. A hint is there are 4 key words here. What are the 4 key words? So we've got 1, it should be controlled. It's not about who owns it, legal benefits, no, it's all about control. It's about this economic resource, which is all about the right. It's about my economic benefits. And another one, present, no, not that one. And the last one is past event. So take any example of an asset that you have. So let's go with, you've got in front of you a calculator. So calculator, you've got it, you have control over it, use the way you like it. You've owned it as a result of past event, being you've purchased it, you've given someone money and you've got that calculator. And that calculator has the right or has the potential for you to produce future economic benefits, i.e. it's going to benefit you in your exams. So that's why the calculator is considered an asset for me. And those keywords that I've highlighted are the words that need to be in your definition. Liabilities now. So liabilities is that present obligation that I was talking about. It is a present obligation, i.e. I should have, I'm obligated to pay someone something. Now, it's a present obligation. As a result of past event, i.e. I have this present obligation to pay you money because I bought something off you before. And what is this present obligation as a result of past event? To transfer economic resource. So I have an obligation to transfer economic resource. So what do you think are the 3 keywords that you need to make sure your definition includes when you're talking about liabilities? It's perfect there. It has to be a present obligation. It has to be because of a past event. And it should include a transfer of economic resource, because otherwise there is no liability. If you don't have to pay anyone, what is your liability? What is your present obligation? What about equity? Equity is an easy one. Well, I say easy. What do you think? How do you define equity? Anyone? Perfect. The keywords, again, I like the buzzwords people are coming with. That is what we need to see in an answer. So an equity is the residual interest. So what does residual mean? Residual means the remaining interest. Whatever is the remaining interest in the assets after deducting its liabilities. Perfect. So that is equity. What about income? So income, you have to think about what is income doing to my accounts. So an income will always increase my assets and it will reduce my liabilities, which will lead to an increase in equity other than contributions from shareholders. So what is a contribution from holders of equity? So, okay, contribution from holders of equity, i.e. holders of equity are investors, spot on. But what is the contribution that they are making that this definition is talking about? It is the purchase of shares, okay? So when they purchase shares, they give the company money. So the company's equity will be increasing when we issue more shares. This definition is saying, yes, there's an increase of share, but other than what they put in the company, any other increase other than that is an income, which makes sense. Because what else goes in equity? Goes my retained earnings. What is retained earnings? It is profit. And profit, in other words, is income. Expenses, on the other hand, is just the opposite. So if I have to talk about expenses, let me put that in red. Expenses is a decrease in asset and increase in liabilities, which will lead to a decrease in equity. Other than not contribution, the opposite of contribution is distribution to holders of equity. So if you learn one, the other one is just the opposite. And that brings us to the end of part B. Any questions from anyone before we move to part C? Again, please don't make notes. I will send this across to everyone. What I do want all of you to do is contribute in the chat box, is give me your 100% focus and attention so that you're understanding things. And if you do have any questions, you get them answered here and all queries are resolved. Perfect. Thank you for that. Moving on. So in my opinion, that would be around, because you have to answer for define 3 of the elements. So let's say, being a bit mean here, it could be more than that in the exam. Let's say that was 1.5 mark. Okay. So that would be half mark per definition. Just making it up. Let's say that's it. Now going on to C. Explain when these elements should be recognized in your financial statements. So when will you recognize a purchase of an asset in your financial statement? That's obvious, when I purchase it. Sadly, you cannot answer the question like that in this exam. You're giving advice based on the amazing financial statements and the conceptual framework. So, when would you recognize an element in your financial statements? I'll give you a clue. There are 3. 2 of them appear somewhere else as well. Perfect. It has to meet the definition that we've all spoken about. So if it meets my definition of an asset, if it meets my definition of a liability, if it meets my definition of an income, yes. It has to be relevant. And what is that relevance that it's talking about? What is relevance? Can anyone explain? What do you think relevance in this situation is? What is relevance? Because you could be asked a question to define relevance instead. Qualitative, fundamental qualitative characteristic. Yes, indeed it is. But how would you explain that? So relevance is information that is relevant, that's going to help the decision makers. Okay, anyone who's reading the accounts, that will help them make a decision. If that information is relevant to them to help them make a decision, then yes. Relevance, yes, is made up of split into 2, predictive value and confirmatory value. i.e., I'm going to take that information that I see in your financial statements and predict whether the cash that you have is enough to cover my expenses next year. And confirmatory is next year's accounts. When I see the cash, I know, well, the business has managed to cover all their expenses and still have some surplus cash at this year. So I'm confirming. So as a decision maker, I want to make sure everything is okay before I make a decision. And any information like that is called relevance. So it's all about the probability of whether there's going to be an inflow or an outflow of cash. And the next one is faithfully represented or faithful representation. In fact, some of you in the chat box have even told me what that means. That means it's all about reliable estimate. Can I reliably estimate the cost? Because if I can't estimate, I am not faithfully representing it or not showing it properly in my accounts. Can people have faith in my accounts if I cannot come up with a reliable estimate? So going back to your definition of faithful representation, what is faithful representation made up of? Yeah, free from error, completeness, unbiased is another one. Okay, so please keep refreshing. The more you refresh other things, the longer it's going to stay in your memory and move from short-term memory to long-term memory. So that was task 3C. The last part is task 3D. D is divided into 2 questions, and we've asked to give some information. Good question. Can I use bullet points in my answer, or do I have to write down everything fully? In this question, they have not told me that this is a letter or it's a memo or anything of that sort. So in that case, I could just state it in a bullet format, leaving ample of white space between each valid point. Perfectly fine. But if you're asked to write an email, if you're asked to put it in a memo, bullet points sadly would not cut the mark. Purely because, would you write an email with just some bullet points and just some keywords? I'm afraid not. In there, it is good to write out. Again, if you use a bullet point, your point should be, as I mentioned, it should be a valid point. And the definition or the meaning of a valid point is state and explain. So you're not just going to write something, just stating it, you have to explain it. Unless the question has just asked you to state it. I.e., as an example, is the first part of the question. First part of the question has asked me just to state, in other words, identify. So I'll just write the words down. Part B has asked me to define. So now I will state it, i.e. put asset, and give an explanation for it, the definition. With the highlighted words, surely need to be part of your answer. The last bit, D, is now a scenario, and your answer, as we discussed when we started this, should link it to the scenario given. Giselle is an accountant who is AAT qualified. So Giselle, AAT qualified. A client of hers, Patriots Limited, has approached her to do some investment business and audit work for them. There is no way she can be supervised to do this work. So no one is going to supervise her to do it, nor is she going to receive any training to do this work. We are asked to explain the response Giselle should give Patriot Limited and explain the ethical consequences of doing the work for Patriots Limited. So let's take the first one. What should Giselle's response be to Patriots? What would you do if you were Giselle? Or what would your recommendation be for Giselle? Decline the work. Yes, indeed. So Giselle should refuse. And why are you saying decline? And when you're writing your answer, make sure you're writing the word her name in, Giselle. Because if you don't write her name in, you're not linking your answer to the scenario given. So Giselle should refuse the work requested by Patriots. So you're showing the marker, I have read the scenario. Again, I've stated the point, but why? So has impact on professional competence and due care. That can be part of my second question, but I'm talking about the ethical consequences of doing the work. Because there I'll talk about my ethical principles of professional competence and due care. Imagine if I went to my client and said, I'm sorry, because of professional competence and due care, they'll look at me and think, what is that? You have done accounts, you have done AAT, so you know what they mean. You've spent 3 levels of learning that. How are you going to tell that to someone else? Someone who hasn't done AAT. How are you going to tell them? I'm sorry, you have to refuse the work because I don't have the required knowledge or skill, because there's a conflict of interest. Perfect, because AAT qualification doesn't allow me to do that. If you say you don't have the required skill, they'd be like, well, you're AAT qualified. So what you need to be saying is because AAT qualification doesn't cover audit or investment business work. And in the next one, you'll think about what you just said. It's all about professional competence and due care. There you will write professional competence and due care. Again, if you write professional competence and due care in your first part, I'm afraid you won't get any marks because you're not answering the question the examiner is asking you. You are answering what you think the examiner is asking you or making it up. So please bear in mind, please do spend time in reading the question and understanding what exactly is the examiner asking me. So in the second bit, yes, I can say that, but in the first bit, sadly, Giselle can't go to her clients and say, oh, I don't have the knowledge. Well, you work for a firm. No, they're not going to help me. I'm afraid that won't come across as a professional answer. Remember, as we said, your answer should always link to the scenario. And that is one of the weaknesses that the examiner has found in several students. So we need to make sure that we don't fall foul to this bit or part A, i.e. the length of the answer. We need to make sure we stick to what exactly the examiner is asking. Just write 1 or 2 sentences, 1 mark, 1 point, move on. And then in the end, if you finish everything and then you still have time, then please go ahead and go back to it and write more. So that brings us to the end of this task.